Alright, so not many of you seem to really care too much about this PC build right here, maybe because it's in a pretty unassuming NZXT case, but I personally think this is one of the coolest PCs that I've ever built. Especially when it comes to mid-tower PCs, I don't think that I've built anything that looks this clean. It's for that reason that I will actually be leaving this one completely assembled, as opposed to what I usually do at this point, which is tearing down the PC, using the parts for future builds, future content and stuff like that. Now the specs for those wondering, we're using an i9-10900K plugged into the Asus Maximus 12 Hero, which is cooled by a huge monoblock from EK, one of my favorite parts of the entire build. I've also installed their 32GB of 3200 CL14 memory, along with a 1TB M.2 NVMe drive. For the GPU, I've installed the RTX 3080 Trinity from Zotac, again cooled by an EK water block and backplate, which are pretty compact, and that should stay nice and cool with the 280mm rad at the front and the 120mm at the back. The water cooling hardware is where I think this build gets really interesting, with the main star of the show being the EK 240mm reservoir at the bottom, which has a D5 pump powering the entire loop. And I guess one of the biggest things, building in a mid-tower case for me, especially when you're doing a custom loop, you have the opportunity to do this, is, filling the void and the empty spaces which would otherwise be in the mid-tower ATX form factor. And we're going with a pretty compact mid-tower here, the H510, but at the same time, only using a single GPU, we would otherwise end up with a lot of empty space which just doesn't look that good underneath the GPU. So the EK240 FLT at the bottom there fills that pretty much perfectly, and I've also 3D printed a custom mount there just to give it a bit more of a floating kind of look. Another piece of hardware that came in really clutch for this build are EK's new rotary offset fittings, and simply put, without these, the really short and efficient tubing runs that we've got here, they just wouldn't have been possible any other way. They come in 3mm, 7mm, and 14mm offset variants, and with these you can honestly make any tubing run possible. Now in conjunction with these, I've also used a few low profile 90-degree fittings from Cleanest, which I've used in other builds, some of you might be familiar with these, and I've also used some static extender fittings, and all in all we get a really precise and satisfying looking loop. Before I actually start using this PC build though, there are a couple of things that I do want to change. Firstly, the front radiator, it is a slim 280mm rad. I'm thinking we can go a little bit thicker just to get a little bit more performance, and obviously just fill out that mid-tower roomy interior a little bit more, make it look a little bit more appropriate. So we'll see how that goes. Secondly, I do also want to replace the UV Black Mayhem's coolant that is in there to just clear coolant from EK, something that's going to be a lot more reliable. I know this black coolant looks super sick, but at the same time, this is not a PC build that I want to tear down in a couple of months. Tearing down the monoblock and everything, that's going to be an absolute pain in the butt, so I'm just going to stick with something that I know works absolutely fine. And while we're at it, we'll also be hooking up the RGB lighting just as a bit of a test to see what it actually looks like, even though we'll probably end up disabling it. We do have a lot of RGB components there, so it will at least be interesting. And then lastly, we'll get to some thermal testing and see how this thing actually performs. So there we go, thicker radiator installed, fresh clear coolant. This thing is now ready to be put to work. Some of you might be wondering how I even installed such a big radiator in the NZXT H510 in the first place, since it's not actually supported. And the answer is very strong double-sided tape, and you do also need to remove the interior cable management bar as well, just to physically fit the damn thing in there in the first place. So yeah, mounting wise, everything is super solid. Obviously it's not ideal, but the trade-off here is to have a much bigger and stronger radiator. It's definitely worth it in my opinion, as opposed to the alternative, which is just going with a supported 280 or 240 and maybe not getting as much cooling performance. And then as for the clear coolant, I will mention before I actually put it in there, I did 2 complete flushes of distilled water just to make sure that all of the black coolant that was in there initially was completely flushed out, or at least as much as I could get out of there in the first place. On second look, it does look a little bit cloudy. You can tell that just a little bit, like a trace amount of that black coolant is still in there, so I might actually do another flush just to get it all completely out. So now let's talk about performance. Firstly, let's talk about the Intel 10900K sitting underneath that monoblock. I've locked the D5 pump speed here at 3000 RPM and the 3 fans at 1100 RPM. Those are the speeds that I'll be pretty much targeting when I dial in a fan curve a little bit later. Overall, quiet and pretty effective. The approach there will be pretty much the same as my main PC in the NCase M1, and that is basing the fan curve completely off of the temperature of the liquid, giving us a much more logical approach to radiator cooling, and in the end also a smoother fan curve that's not suddenly ramping up and down. So with the 10900K at full load in Cinebench, there is no problem at all in terms of cooling or performance, as you would expect from a mid-tower custom loop. I've completely unlocked all of the power limits here, which have us sitting at 4.9 GHz across all 10 cores, but I haven't done any further optimization in terms of tuning the voltage, the LLC, or anything like that. And honestly, I don't think I will. It's just not needed when we're getting such good performance here out of the box at full load. VRM temperatures as well seem to be rock solid at about 50 degrees C, and I'll mention that this is all with a room temp of about 24 C. Then when we take a look at 4K gaming with the RTX 3080, performance there is super confident as well. I've added a small overclock here too, not that we can really expect much from overclocking these days, but for what it's worth, I've maxed out the power limit, overclocked the GPU core by 80 MHz, and the memory by 500 MHz. This has us sitting at around 330 to 340 watts or so at full gaming load, around 1900 MHz for the GPU clock, with the GPU core only at 54 C after about 45 minutes. Again, this was with the fan speed at just 1100 RPM, which even for the EK Vata fans that we're using here, that is pretty quiet, and that meant that our coolant temp was maxing out at just 43 C. All in all, rock solid thermal performance here at low noise levels, just as I was hoping. So yeah, performance-wise, I am pretty happy with what we're seeing here. You know, despite using a compact mid-tower, we are actually able to extract quite a bit of cooling performance out of this case. And, you know, this entire build, I kind of approached it from, I guess, an ITX point of view, right? Trying to make use of all of the empty space and just trying to cram as much as I could in here in terms of cooling performance and components. And I do think it worked out quite well. You know, the bigger radiator at the front there and even at the rear, these are components that you wouldn't even think twice to install in the NZXT H510, but with some creative mounting methods, you can actually make it work. So personally, really looking forward to getting a lot more use out of this one. If you're interested in the parts or the build video, I will leave that linked down below. As always, hey, huge thanks for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.